Everything about the two disastrous atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. World War II is perhaps the most brutal and horrifying war in human history, and when it comes to this 6-year-long conflict, there are countless famous events, from the massacres of Jewish civilians by Nazi Germany to the atrocities committed by the Empire of Japan, the large-scale campaigns of the Allies, and the fierce battles that resulted in millions of casualties. However, one of the most famous events is undoubtedly the 2 atomic bombings by the United States on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. These were also the first and only times that atomic bombs were used in actual warfare, and their consequences were truly terrifying, haunting generations of humanity. General context. In 1945, World War II was gradually coming to an end, with the Allied forces launching a series of campaigns on both the Western and Eastern fronts in Europe, pushing back the Axis forces. By May 8, 1945, after the fall of Berlin and Nazi Germany's signing of an unconditional surrender agreement, the war in Europe came to an end. Meanwhile, in the Pacific theater, the war continued to rage fiercely between the Allies and the military of the Empire of Japan. However, the Empire of Japan was increasingly finding itself at a disadvantage, especially after its defeats in the battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, combined with a series of bombing campaigns targeting Japanese cities. The prospect of completely ending the war in 1945 was entirely feasible. Nevertheless, the Empire of Japan showed no intention of surrendering, despite the growing damage and civilian casualties caused by the bombings. 66 Japanese cities had been subjected to air raids, with approximately 1.7 million people losing their homes, hundreds of thousands killed or injured, especially in the napalm bombing of Tokyo on March 9, 1945, which claimed at least 100,000 lives. Even so, just 2 days after the Tokyo bombing, Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo expressed a view shared by many senior members of the Japanese government, stating that the people would gradually become accustomed to daily bombings, and over time, their spirit of unity and determination would grow even stronger. But the reality was undeniable. The Japanese military was almost incapable of resisting the pressure from the Allied forces, particularly the United States. The main forces that had brought them numerous victories in the Pacific theater, namely their Navy and Air Force, had been largely eliminated from the fight. Japan's industrial base was heavily devastated, and the home islands were under a severe blockade. With few weapons left to resist the Allies, Japanese generals turned to the one weapon they still held an advantage in: the samurai spirit, a willingness to die for the emperor. Combat in early 1945 showed that kamikaze suicide planes were an effective weapon. Although it cost the lives of over 3,900 pilots and their aircraft, they inflicted heavy damage on the Allied Navy. By July 1945, Japan still had 12,725 aircraft of various types, nearly all of which were intended to be used as suicide planes. The Japanese military even drafted a plan for a fight to the death by the entire Japanese population. Beyond suicide planes, Japan also had various other suicide weapons at sea. For ground combat, Japan mobilized a total of 53 divisions and 25 independent brigades, amounting to 2.35 million troops to counter the Allies, compared to approximately 1.25 million fewer Allied troops. The Navy, having lost its warships, would also fight on land alongside the Army. Additionally, the entire population was mobilized, with men aged 15 to 60 and women aged 17 to 45, totaling 28 million people, armed with whatever weapons were available, from rifles to bows, arrows, swords, and spears. Furthermore, there were 4 million defense workers organized into independent combat battalions, tasked with both production and combat. In addition, Japan's armed forces included 3 million troops stationed abroad. Apart from distant territories such as New Guinea, the Indonesian archipelago, and Indochina, Japanese forces were heavily concentrated in northeast China, particularly in Manchuria and Korea. The spearhead of the Japanese army was the Kwantung Army, with a strength of nearly 1 million troops. According to the operational plan for the summer of 1945, if the home islands fell, they would retreat to Manchuria and continue resisting to the end. The Japanese government decided to fight to the last person, believing that the U.S. would give up if the casualties from attacking the Japanese homeland became too heavy. American public opinion would turn against the war, forcing the government to negotiate, and on that basis, Japan could propose favorable ceasefire conditions. On the Allied side, the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff presented President Truman with a plan to attack Japan, codenamed Operation Downfall. The plan was divided into two phases, Operation Olympic and Operation Coronet, both starting with prolonged carpet bombing campaigns by Army aircraft taking off from China and Korea. The U.S. estimated that they would suffer at least 100,000 casualties in Operation Olympic and 250,000 in Operation Coronet. However, the successful test of the first atomic bomb, codenamed Trinity, on July 16, 1945, offered a faster and far more terrifying solution to force Japan into unconditional surrender, the atomic bombing of Japan. Immediately afterward, from July 17 to August 2, representatives of the Allied nations, the Soviet Union, the United States, and the United Kingdom, met at the Potsdam Conference to discuss critical issues in the war, including the swift defeat of the Empire of Japan and the end of the conflict. On July 26, the UK, the US, and the Republic of China issued and sent Japan the Potsdam Declaration, an ultimatum demanding Japan's immediate unconditional surrender, stating, "We call upon the government of Japan to proclaim now the unconditional surrender of all Japanese armed forces and to provide proper and adequate assurances of their good faith in such action. The alternative for Japan is prompt and utter destruction." On July 26, Japan received this declaration, and reactions among its leadership varied. While the Japanese government offered no specific response, the militarists deemed the declaration arrogant and insisted that the government reject it immediately. In the afternoon of July 28, during a meeting, Prime Minister Kentaro Suzuki declined to comment on the declaration, and Japan continued the war. With this decision from Japan, the U.S. resolved to use atomic bombs to end the war as quickly as possible. The Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings. The developments in the Pacific Theater and the attitude of the Japanese government toward the Potsdam Declaration led to the U.S. decision to use atomic bombs to end the war. However, the question arises here: where would the U.S. deploy this weapon of mass destruction on Japanese soil? In the spring of 1945, the U.S. military convened a committee of numerous officers and scientists to decide where the atomic bombs should be dropped. This committee identified two objectives for the atomic bombings. First, to terrify the Japanese into unconditional surrender, and second, to impress the world with the power of this new type of weapon. Historian Alex Wellerstein argued that, at the time, the U.S. was still weighing questions such as whether the target should be a city, a military base, or simply a demonstration of the bomb without causing casualties. Meanwhile, physicist Edward Teller believed that the only hope was to let people see the results of what they had done, as this could convince everyone that the next war would be utterly devastating. For this purpose, using the atomic bomb in actual combat might be the best option. Thus, around May 1945, the Target Selection Committee proposed several locations as bombing targets: Kyoto, Hiroshima, Yokohama, and Kokura. The committee rejected limiting the use of atomic weapons to purely military targets due to the risk of missing small targets located within civilian areas. For the committee, the psychological impact on Japan was crucial, and they agreed that the first use of an atomic bomb needed to be meticulously prepared, as its significance would resonate internationally. Kyoto was initially selected because it was Japan's former capital and a cultural center, while Hiroshima was a large city and a logistical hub for the military. Tokyo was ruled out, as the city had already suffered severe damage from the napalm bombing on March 9 earlier that year. After much debate and consideration, Kyoto was ultimately removed from the list of targets due to its cultural significance, with the U.S. fearing a harsh public backlash if it destroyed a historic cultural center. Consequently, the focus shifted to Hiroshima, followed by secondary targets such as Kokura and Nagasaki, should Japan still refuse to surrender. At the time of the bombing, Hiroshima was a city of significant military and industrial importance, hosting several military camps, including the headquarters of the 5th Division and the 2nd Army Group under Field Marshal Hada Shunroku, which was responsible for the defense of southern Japan. Hiroshima was a minor logistical base for the Japanese military, as well as a center for communications, storage, and weapons assembly for the armed forces. Another reason for choosing Hiroshima, as reported by General Spitz, was that it had no prisoner of war camps. Based on these reasons, Washington designated it as the primary target. On the morning of August 6, 3 B-29 Superfortress bombers appeared in the skies over Hiroshima, 2 of which carried cameras and scientific equipment to record the effects, while the third, named Enola Gay, was tasked with dropping the bomb. At 8:00 a.m., the radar station in Hiroshima detected that the number of incoming aircraft was very small, no more than 3, and canceled the order to prepare for an air defense. At 8:15, the Enola Gay opened its bomb bay, and less than a minute later, most of Hiroshima was obliterated in a blinding flash. The bomb dropped on Hiroshima, named Little Boy, detonated approximately 600 meters above the ground, with a destructive force equivalent to 13,000 tons of TNT. Around 90,000 people died instantly, and thousands more perished later due to radiation exposure, burns, or shockwaves. The radius of destruction was 1.6 kilometers, with fires covering an area of 4.4 square kilometers, and an estimated 90% of Hiroshima's buildings were destroyed or damaged. By December 1945, the total death toll in Hiroshima for that year had risen to 140,000, and over the next 40 years, hundreds more died each year due to lingering radiation effects. Following the explosion, President Truman's staff in Washington issued a further warning, stating that if the Japanese government did not surrender immediately, the U.S. declared, "If they do not now accept our terms, they may expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth." On August 8, approximately 6 million leaflets were dropped from the air over 47 Japanese cities, with populations exceeding 100,000, describing the destructive power of the atomic bomb, equivalent to 2,000 B-29s, attacking simultaneously, and urging the Japanese people to petition the emperor to end the war. The Japanese government still did not respond to the Potsdam Declaration, with Emperor Hirohito, the government, and the War Council still deliberating 4 conditions in exchange for Japan's surrender: maintaining the imperial system and national polity, entrusting the disarmament of the military to the empire's leadership, avoiding occupation of Japan, and allowing the Japanese government to prosecute war criminals. Prior to this, on August 5, Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov informed Tokyo of the abrogation of the Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact, and just minutes after midnight on August 8, Tokyo time, the Soviet Union launched a simultaneous offensive with infantry, armor, and air forces against Japan's Kwantung Army stationed in Manchuria. 4 hours later, at dawn on August 9, Tokyo received the Soviet government's declaration of war. As the Japanese government continued to refuse surrender, the U.S. decided to drop a second bomb, this time targeting the city of Nagasaki. Nagasaki had once been the largest port city in southern Japan, playing a crucial role in naval operations due to its diverse industrial activities, ranging from the production of munitions, ships, and military equipment to materials supporting the war effort, and it was one of the few cities that had not yet been subjected to large-scale bombing. On August 9, a B-29 named Boxcar was assigned the bombing mission, similar to the Hiroshima bombing, with the bomb named Fat Man. At 7:50 a.m. Japan time, air raid sirens sounded in Nagasaki, but they were silenced at 8:30 when only 2 B-29s approached. At 10:53, the Japanese assumed they were reconnaissance planes and did not issue further alerts. At around 11:01, the Fat Man bomb was dropped over the city's industrial valley, detonating 43 seconds later at an altitude of 469 meters above the ground, with a destructive force equivalent to 21,000 tons of TNT. At the time of the explosion, approximately 200,000 people were in the city. However, because the bomb was dropped somewhat hastily, it exploded between two primary targets, the steel and weapons factory to the north and the torpedo factory to the south. Had the bomb veered further south, the commercial and residential areas of the city would have suffered far greater damage, which is the main factor explaining why this bomb, despite having a higher explosive yield than the one in Hiroshima, caused less severe destruction. Nevertheless, an estimated 70,000 people died instantly when the bomb exploded, with tens of thousands more injured, and the blast radius was 1.6 kilometers, with fires stretching from the northern part of the city to 3.2 kilometers south of the explosion. The two bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki killed at least 160,000 people instantly, while the number of injuries and subsequent deaths due to radiation exposure is impossible to fully tally. The U.S. even had plans to use additional bombs if the Japanese government remained resolute in not surrendering. However, the two tragedies in Hiroshima and Nagasaki forced Emperor Hirohito and many Japanese leaders to reconsider their stance. Subsequent events and public reactions. A few hours before the second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, the Supreme War Council of the Japanese government convened to consider whether to accept the Potsdam Declaration, with the militarists steadfastly opposing it. However, on the evening of August 9, after news of the Nagasaki disaster emerged, the emperor summoned the Supreme Council again, instructing them to accept the terms, provided that the imperial family and the succession rights were preserved. The Japanese government immediately relayed these conditions to the U.S., and the following day, U.S. Secretary of State James Burns argued that there should be no distinction between the emperor and others. However, Secretary of War Henry Stimson contended that only the emperor's authority could compel the Japanese armed forces to surrender, thereby avoiding unnecessary battles in the future and giving the Soviet Union less time to consolidate in the Pacific region. In response to Japan, the U.S. emphasized that the Japanese would not be allowed to choose their form of government, but agreed to ensure the safety of the emperor and the imperial family. Meanwhile, Japanese military leaders still refused to accept defeat, and debates continued for several days. Finally, on August 14, the emperor announced his decision to accept the Potsdam Declaration, even stating that he would record a speech to be broadcast nationwide, an unprecedented act. However, the pro-war faction adamantly opposed this, and that night they attempted a coup to prevent the emperor's message from being broadcast, deceiving and pressuring the 2nd Imperial Guard Regiment to join them, storming the palace, and destroying the recording containing the surrender announcement. The emperor, along with Marquis Kido and other officials, managed to evade the rebels, who failed to find them. And when loyal troops arrived, the coup's leader, Major Kenji Hatanaka, and several others committed suicide. By noon on August 15, Japanese radio stations simultaneously broadcast the emperor's message, calling for all forces to surrender. On August 17, the surrender order was issued to Japanese troops still scattered across Japan and abroad. On the morning of August 28, the first units of the U.S. 11th Airborne Division set foot on Japanese soil, marking the beginning of the military occupation by U.S. forces on behalf of the Allies. In the afternoon of August 30, General Douglas MacArthur established a temporary headquarters in Yokohama, later moving to Tokyo. On September 2, 1945, aboard the U.S. battleship Missouri anchored in Tokyo Bay, under the chairmanship of General MacArthur, representatives of the Japanese government, Mamoru Shigemitsu, and the Japanese General Staff, General Yoshijiro Umezu, formally signed the instrument of unconditional surrender to the Allies, officially ending World War II. Despite playing a significant role in ending World War II quickly and decisively, avoiding many unnecessary battles in the Pacific theater, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki have sparked considerable controversy, with opposition primarily centered on two main reasons. The bombing caused massive civilian casualties, an act deemed immoral, and the bombing was tactically unnecessary and morally indefensible. Many individuals and organizations criticize the bombings, with many considering them war crimes and crimes against humanity. Two prominent figures, Albert Einstein and Leo Szilard, despite having previously co-signed a letter to President Roosevelt in 1939 encouraging atomic bomb research, were among the critics. Szilard argued as follows: "Let me focus primarily on the ethical issue. Suppose Germany had successfully developed 2 atomic bombs before us, and suppose Germany dropped those bombs, for example, on Rochester, New York, in the United States, and then lost the war. Would anyone hesitate to call that a war crime and hold the Germans accountable for such actions at the Nuremberg trials, sentencing them to death by hanging?" Many scientists involved in the Manhattan Project also voiced opposition to the bomb's use in practice, with 7 leading scientists, headed by Dr. James Franck, submitting a report to President Truman's Interim Committee in May 1945, which included the following passage: "If the United States is the first nation to use this indiscriminate weapon of destruction, we will lose the support of public opinion worldwide, while simultaneously triggering an arms race and hindering the possibility of reaching international agreements on controlling such weapons in the future." Professor Peter Kuznick, director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at American University, also commented on President Truman's decision to authorize the nuclear bombings, stating that he knew he was initiating a process of annihilating life, not just a war crime, but a crime against humanity. Joseph Gerson was among those who believed that the U.S. motivation for the bombings was to demonstrate the power of the new weapon to the Soviet Union. Historian Martin Sherwin of Cornell University also argued that impressing the Russians was more important than ending the war with Japan. From a military perspective, many, including senior U.S. generals, believed that the use of atomic bombs was unnecessary, as Japan was already on the verge of surrender and conventional bombings had already been sufficient to exert pressure. General Dwight Eisenhower later wrote in his memoirs, "In 1945, Secretary of War Stimson visited my headquarters in Germany, informing me that our government was preparing to drop an atomic bomb on Japan. I was one of those who felt there were strong reasons to question the wisdom of that action. As he recounted the details, I felt dismayed and expressed my doubts to him. First, because I believed Japan was already defeated, and the nuclear bombing was entirely unnecessary, and second, because I thought the use of such a weapon was not essential to minimize American casualties, as our nation should avoid a precedent that would shock the world by employing such a weapon." Other U.S. generals shared Eisenhower's view, including General Carl Spaatz, the highest-ranking officer in the Pacific Theater, Fleet Admiral William Halsey, the top official in the President's Executive Office, General Curtis LeMay, Commander of U.S. Strategic Air Forces in the Pacific, Lieutenant General Edward Hull, a military intelligence officer, and several others. Fleet Admiral William Halsey also stated, "The use of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki did not materially aid our war against Japan. The Japanese were already defeated and ready to surrender." Of course, alongside the opposition, there was also a body of opinion in favor of the decision to bomb Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Supporters of the bombings argued that the two explosions ended the war months earlier, thereby saving hundreds of thousands of lives, asserting that the Soviet offensive in Manchuria could only have driven Japan out of mainland Asia, but not defeated it on its home islands. As mentioned, if Operations Olympic and Coronet had been carried out, the Allies would have suffered an additional 1.2 million casualties, including at least 267,000 deaths. Proponents of the bombings also pointed out that prolonging the wait for Japan's surrender was not a cost-free option, as the war was claiming 200,000 civilian lives monthly in Asia from February 1945, with conventional bombings killing over 100,000 people in Japan each month, a trend that would have continued until U.S. forces landed and Japan surrendered. The atomic bombs brought World War II in Asia to a swift end, liberating millions of people in occupied territories and avoiding unnecessary battles and bloodshed. Thus, while many condemned and criticized the use of atomic bombs, their role in ending World War II cannot be entirely dismissed. However, the consequences of the two bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki did not end quickly and persist to this day, with those affected by the bombings known as hibakusha, and as of 2023, there are still hundreds of thousands of such survivors in Japan. The memorials in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, along with the victims of these bombings, stand as eternal warnings to humanity about the terrifying dangers of nuclear weapons, which have the potential to destroy entire civilizations. And that concludes the information on the events before, during, and after the horrific tragedies in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. What are your thoughts on the U.S. decision to use atomic bombs? Was it truly necessary? Please share your opinions in the comments section below.